Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Strength and Weakness podcast. Spoiler alert, as you can tell, we have a new name, and you can also see our faces if you're watching this on YouTube. So
This is what we look like.
yeah,
Sorry, we're not better looking.
So wanted to first just give some updates, lots of changes over here at the Strength and Weakness ministry. And first is we have some updates to our podcast, one being the name. I'm sure a lot of you are asking, where did this name change come from? And really, this is just to go along with more of our branding. We are the Strength and Weakness ministry. And previously, we had the Home from Home podcast, which has been an incredible, run for us. And we're keeping with that podcast. We just have a new name. So think of it more as a facelift. But you will be hearing the introduction there. But the fun part is that we will still have, the sub episodes for Ellen and I roughly once a month. That will still be our beautifully messy home from home, little snippets. But it will now be the beautifully messy home to Strength and Weakness podcast.
Exactly. Yeah, the podcast got a facelift, to be clear, but not us.
Right. You will, speaking of faces, though, you will also be seeing some new faces on this podcast. One being Guy Hammond, who is our everything strength and weakness. I think his technical title is the CEO, executive director, the one who's really leading the charge. So you'll get to see and hear from him more often. And then on top of that, we also have our colleague, Davion, who will be joining Guy in some of those. So you're going to see us mix and match a little bit. I'll be on some podcasts with Guy. Davion and Guy will be joining some of our podcasts. But we wanted to make sure that you still got the duo that you anxiously await for every month, which is Ellen and I.
Yes, we're very excited to be back at it.
Yes. And before we jump into our beautifully messy moment, we actually are going to be switching that messy moment out this week for a quick PSA. And I'm going to be making the PSA because we thought that it would be funny coming from Ellen. But if you've been following our ministry, and Ellen has mentioned it a few times before on our podcast, that she was writing a book. And she has now released that book, and it is called Love Covers Over. So as you can see, I have my very own copy here with a handwritten autograph. Just check that out. Handwritten autograph.
Check out that beautiful handwriting that I got made fun of for as a kid.
Oh, I love it. So I wanted to give a quick PSA about it because it is going to be something that you want in your library at home, or it's going to be something that you will hand to a parent or a youth leader or a teacher, because I won't butcher it, but her tag or, subheading is A Guide for Christian Parents Raising Kids in an LGBTQ plus world. I have read it, and our whole staff has read it. And the quick takeaway that I will leave you with is that right now we are in some unprecedented times as far as how to approach as Christians the LGBTQ community as a whole, and what our kids are going through at school, what our friends' kids are going through, and really as a society, how as Christians do we approach these topics? And what I love the most, I've written certain articles and books with Ellen and gotten to experience just her writing as a whole. And I think what you will appreciate the most is that it's written. She's so smart. I mean, as you can tell, if you're listening to this podcast, she is just a wealth of knowledge. But the way that she takes these really big concepts and boils them down to be really digestible and also have so many good practicals and analogies, it really takes these hard to talk about topics and allows for conversation to come from them. So as you can tell, I'm totally biased towards Ellen in every way, shape, and form. But I think you will really, really enjoy reading this book and just find it so helpful and so beneficial. So Ellen, I'll let you comment on your own book. Please toot your own horn, but we would love to hear from you.
Well, I'm just saying thanks so much, Morgan, for plugging the book. Totally unprompted by me, right? I'm not like puppeting you on this. You can put the script away that I gave you. No, but I'm so grateful for that plug. And I'm grateful for that feedback. Honestly, I hear that from a lot of people that I don't know. I didn't write the book thinking that would be what other people take away, but I hear the same exact thing, that it's difficult topics, but it's easily digestible, and that they appreciate the practicals. And I'm so glad, because I put a lot of work into making it practical, making it fundamental for people. So I'm glad to hear that that's coming across to people. I will say, my next book, I really want it to be on romantic intimacy, right? This is more about intimacy with your children and how to navigate these difficult topics in your home while your children are growing up, or even when they're adults and they are, have an LGBTQ identity. But my next book, I really wanted to write. I'm still workshopping ideas. Let me know if you guys have any ideas on the title. But something like what my two husbands have taught me about love and intimacy, basically referencing what my earthly husband has taught me about my heavenly husband's love. And so, but that kind of leads us into this question that we're going to field today about marriage and intimacy and sex. I got this question a while back from someone who said something to the effect of, will I ever not be repulsed when I have sex with my husband? She's same-sex attracted. Her husband is not. They've been married for many years. They have children. They have grandchildren. But, just sex is a point of contention for them in their relationship. And I know you wanted to highlight something, Morgan, from her question.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we jump into this too, I just want to make sure that you all understand that Ellen is more than qualified to speak on this subject and to write these books. I love that she has like 20 books in her mind because we want to hear more from her. But she is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and she also specializes in childhood, adolescent sexuality. So I always want to point that out, because it's not just somebody who wants to talk about the topic. I think the blogs and books are so saturated right now with people who are aspiring authors, which I think is great. But she definitely has research and education behind it as well, which I think makes her work so much richer. So as Ellen mentioned, really moving into the podcast topic today, the quote that is standing out to me is from this, woman who sent in the question or statement was, love and sex just don't go together for me. I don't know if any of you guys can relate, but I'm so grateful for this woman's courage to share this thought, share this, life situation that she's in, because I think the truth of it is, whether you are in a heterosexual marriage or you are in a marriage with somebody who's same-sex attracted, I think we can all agree that there are stages and seasons in life where it feels like love and sex just don't go together. And I, like, spoiler alert to anybody who's listening to this who is not married yet, I do think there is, especially in the purity culture within the Christian churches, there is this expectation that having sex will solve so many problems. If you're addicted to pornography, if you're unhappy being single, if you are, habitually masturbating, if you are, all of these things, it's, oh, well, if I get married, they'll all go away. And I will say, I was victim of that. I definitely thought that when I got married, things personally and also with the spouse that I was choosing to marry, that these things would be fixed. But unfortunately, we're still sinful, and we still need God's grace, and all of those things are not fixed with marriage. So today we're going to unpack that a little bit, and hopefully you find something beneficial out of this chat that Ellen and I are going to have. Ellen, was there anything else that you wanted to add before we jump into it?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, not only are we all sinful, but I think we're also all fallen. We're all broken. And I guess that's wrapped up in sin, right? Like, we're fallen because we chose sin over God's way. But I think sometimes I like to separate those, because we're all sinful, and sin makes its way into the love that we share with other people, into our romantic relationships, into our sexual relationships. But so does our natural fallenness and brokenness. Like, we don't have to commit a sin in order to experience that in a fallen way. We already experience it in a fallen way. I mean, love in and of itself is a fallen state, or marriage and sex in marriage is a fallen state of experiencing God's love for us. It's meant to point us to God's love, but it's not meant to replace it. Certainly not meant to provide for us the love, connection, fulfillment, identity, and worth that we were created for, that we all long for, and that we often turn our sights on marriage and sex to fulfill. Then we all end up feeling more starved than we did before we pursued that relationship. And I think there's a reason, because we're setting our sights too low. We need to set it higher to God and say, how can He fulfill all of those desires of mine? And how can I utilize my marriage, my sexual relationship in my marriage, to point toward God's greater love for me, instead of finding all of those things in marriage and sex? It's already fallen.
It's a great point. And it leads me to have a question that comes from that, which is, when we enter marriage and we have this expectation that that sex or love with a spouse can fix these things. And again, this is, I love that somebody who's same-sex attracted submitted this, but this really could be a topic for all marriages. Mm-hmm. But Ellen, what would you suggest to somebody who's like, okay, I'm in this marriage now, and I'm realizing that love and sex are not going together for me. When I have sex with my spouse, I don't feel loved. I even feel repulsed. I don't want to do it. How do you bridge the gap between, hey, I entered this marriage thinking that it was going to be like wonderful and glorious and that I was going to be completely satisfied, and now I'm in a place that I'm unhappy and disgusted by the intimacy that should have been a positive thing within this marriage? And how do you reconcile the grief or the disappointment that lives between what was reality and what is reality and what was the hope or the expectation?
Yeah, well, I would say the first thing you got to do is grieve, right? Because we often, before we grieve, we frantically try to recreate or create the reality that we had envisioned. We spend all of our time and effort and intention on that, and we just can't restore Eden, right? Where we were intended to grow up and have marriage and sex within the confines of Eden. We cannot restore that. It will always be fallen this side of heaven. So instead of spending all of our effort on restoring something we can't, we have to stop and grieve alongside God. That's the good news, is that He grieves it too. He mourns it too. We're not alone in that. So once we get to that place of grief, then we can move toward acceptance of the reality that is. And once we get there, we can say, now what? What do I do with this reality? Instead of let me run in this direction and try to make this reality happen that will never will, we can say, here's what is. And it's sad, but it can also be beautiful in the midst of the brokenness. How can I make it beautiful with this reality?
That's great. And to continue that question, how would you make it beautiful? So speaking to this person who submitted this question, like, how do you reconcile and make it beautiful when this is, you have taken a vow and a commitment to stay in this marriage? How do you reconcile that when it feels so, the tunnel feels so narrow, right? You're like, you're I can only imagine what this woman is going through. It's like, wow, I end up feeling more like I'm living with a roommate rather than living in this thriving marriage. Mm-hmm. What advice would you give somebody if they're like, how do I turn this around? How do I recultivate the intimacy that feels so lost, especially if people have been married for 20 plus years, what would be your suggestions to them?
Yeah, I think redefining, I love the word that you used, intimacy. That's the word I use in my therapy practice when couples come in and say, hey, we're not having as much sex as we used to. Oh no, right? Or I don't find my spouse as attractive as I once did. Oh no, what do we do? And because people have equated love and relational happiness with the quality of their sex life. And so we kind of have to unpack all of those things. And I always like to use the words intimacy and connection. That's how I would describe love. That's what we all want. That's what we're hoping our marriages will provide, is intimacy and connection. The way I would define that is being seen, known, and understood. That certainly happens in sex, but if it's only happening in sex, we have a real problem. I like to talk about intimacy like a stool, right? So if you have a stool that you sit on and it has one really strong leg, you are going to topple over 100% of the time, right? Unless you're some crazy Cirque du Soleil acrobat, right? So
no matter how strong that leg is, it will
no
still,
matter how Exactly. No matter how robust that one leg is, it's going to topple over. You need multiple legs to hold up this stool of intimacy. So, I find couples that get married and have a really strong attraction, there's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes their intimacy is really being held up by that one strong leg. And
Mm.
then a couple of years into it, when they start to look a little bit different, or their libido changes, or their attraction template changes, they're in real trouble in terms of their overall intimacy. Instead, if we build out that stool of intimacy with multiple legs and say, our shared values, our shared memories, our underlying friendship, our partnership in the gospel, all of these things help to make up our intimacy together.
Mm.
How can I be seen, known, and understood in those areas of our life by you? And how can I see, know, and understand you in those areas of our life? Then we're able to withstand one gimpy leg on a stool, like attraction, when all those other legs are really fortified. So, like me and you, Morgan, right? We've talked about this on the podcast before. We do experience some attraction toward our husbands. We don't really have a way of knowing how that compares to our heterosexual friends who are attracted to their husbands. Like, we don't really know what that is like. But we do experience some attraction to our husbands because we're women, because sexuality for women tends to be more fluid and more broad. However, maybe that stool on our leg of intimacy with our husbands is a little bit more gimpy, maybe, than some of our female peers who are heterosexually
Yeah.
attracted. But what I have found, and I know what you have found because we've talked about it, is sort of like a blind person who is forced to rely on their other senses, and those senses become really heightened. I have found it's such a gift to have that bit of a gimpy leg on my stool of intimacy with my husband, because we have really worked to fortify those other legs on our stool of intimacy, and therefore our overall intimacy and connection is very rich and very rooted, very secure in its foundation. It's not rocked when hormones are changing, or when our looks change, or when our libido changes. So I think a lot of people pity those who are same-sex attracted. I'm really grateful that my husband and I have had to navigate this, because it's led to a really much stronger intimacy. Is that what you find in your relationship with your husband, or what are your thoughts on that, Morgan?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have this conversation quite often, because when we talk to other couples about intimacy, and we talk to, and we understand what the legs of their stools and how they interact with those and the strength of them, we always take a step back. And my husband usually communicates this to me. He's like, wow, I thank you, but I would have never had to dive this far into the emotional and, probably the emotional leg of the stool as much if I would have married somebody who wasn't same sex attracted. And it's true. Like, having been in relationships with other women, I usually say that I was on like an emotional high 99% of the time, because the relationships were so codependent, so enmeshed. Just, I mean, imagine two women's emotions, right? Like, it's just on on 10 all the time. And so when I got married, I was like, why are emotions not heightened all the time? And he's like, I don't know. And I was like, and as we've matured and gotten older, I'm like, oh, it's because it's not how God designed you to be. And so now we balance each other out. And so I do think if we can shift our perspective to see it as a gift and see it as a blessing, and realize that the more we pour into each four of our, the legs of our stools, the richer our marriage becomes as a whole. And so if I were to take a step back and talk to this woman who submitted this question, or really anybody else who's feeling really unhappy in their marriages when it comes to intimacy, I would beg you to consider that intimacy can be is more than just in the bedroom. And it will feel very awkward if tomorrow you're like, all right, it has to be in the bedroom, and I'm going to make this a 10 out of 10, because there is still so much missing internally. And so I would say, like, really, which I'm sure you are already praying about it, but like really praying that God reignites the intimacy inside of you for your husband, and having those open dialogues. I find that a lot of times some of these things are stunted because there's lack of conversation between spouses, as far as, hey, this is what I'm going through and this is what I'm struggling with, as far as feeling connected in these four legs of the stool. I am feeling maybe really connected in our intellectual conversations, or you know, doing household chores or whatever those legs might be for you, but to really dive in and say, like, there's still something missing for me when it comes to our physical intimacy and our emotional intimacy. Especially if you're coming from a same-sex background, I would say the emotional side of it is really high. And sometimes, and I have fallen victim to this too, is like I end up looking for that emotional connection with my friends rather than my spouse. And I've realized that that steals intimacy from me and my spouse and puts it in the wrong places, where it's not that I'm going to like, I'm not going out of my way to search for that intimacy with a friend. But what I realize is the emotional connection that I'm getting, it's feeding that leg of my stool. And so then I'm not giving that to my husband. And so I have really, even, you know, in the last couple of years, made sure that the emotional connection that I'm having with my husband is met there first. And then everything else is just, well, met with God and then met with my husband. And then everybody else is just additional to making that cup overflow.
Yeah, I love that. And I would say, I love how you put that at the end too. Like, we have to get it from God, because sometimes we can steal that connection from God and offer it to our spouses or our friends or our parents or whomever in our life. And I think we have to be really careful, because even our spouses who love us maybe most in this world, of all the people in this world, might be our spouses that love us most. Even they aren't able to offer perfect love the way that we were created for. So we have to go to God first, get that met, then offer the next fruit, right? The first fruits goes to God. The next fruits of intimacy go to our spouses, and then whoever else in our life, our parents, our friends, our children. But also, I think that, you know, kind of like what stuck out to you in this person's question, Morgan, love and sex don't go together. I would say, yeah, that's true. I mean, in a way, right? That's true. Love and sex don't have to go together. Love and sex can go together. Sex is a part of love, of intimacy and connection, being seen, known, and understood. It certainly is not the only part of it. And if it is not a part of it for you, or not as big a part of it as you thought it would be in your marriage, that's okay. That doesn't mean you're starting at ground zero or you have no intimacy and love and connection in your relationship. You can still work on that leg of your stool. There are so many other legs that make up your overall intimacy. I think it's time we start turning to those other legs and appreciating what's already there, and then also trying to fortify those other legs in building intimacy and connection, and a little bit broader, not just through sex. So yeah, sex is a part of love, but it's certainly not all of it, and they're not mutually exclusive. You can have love, intimacy, and connection, even if your sex life isn't exactly what you always thought it would be. Don't forget to grieve, get that, you know, that initial intimacy met through God, but then look at what else God has given you, the joys he's given you in the rest of that connection with your spouse.
That's great, Ellen. And I think the last thing I'll say about this before we wrap it up is that also just being aware of what channels we're receiving information from. So at least for me, when I realize that intimacy, I'm trying to grow my intimacy with my husband, I have to be really careful of like what movies and what things I'm watching and listening to, because we live in a sexualized society. Like wherever you look, it is sexualized. And so I think there is an understanding too that there are times that I hear things or I watch things and I'm like, well, wow, my spouse isn't like that, or my marriage isn't like that. And then it skews my perspective. And so I think starting at the source of the Bible of like, what does God say love and intimacy are? And then just putting all of your energy and resources into strengthening your marriage, and maybe taking a break from some things that might be hindering that growth. But Ellen, as always, such a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I do look forward to the next book you are going to write, which I think will touch on a lot of what we shared today. So if you want to get on that, you know, I know you just released your other book. You can, you know, start working on that. But to all of our listeners, we hope that you come back, join us again at the Strength and Weakness podcast, and we'll see you next time.